Well, I was asked to talk a little bit about conservation. So this is going to be the final part of the presentation. Basically, a lot of cacti are really at risk, around 31% of cacti. This is a bit of an older statistic now. I think it's much higher than this, but our cacti in habitat are in trouble. And basically a lot of them have a really narrow distribution range, and they're really vulnerable to habitat destruction or climate change, mining operations too, and poaching and demand from the horticultural trade. So I'll talk about the poaching issue briefly. Basically, in cultivation, we tend to hold plants in an ornamental value. We put a price tag on them, but we have to keep remembering that they have an ecological value too, and they have a purpose to serve in habitat. The flower of a plant is the base of the food chain. The pollen is rich in protein, the nectar glands are full of sugar, and that's where it all begins. The insects come and eat that, the lizards come and eat the insects, and so on. But what we're noticing, especially with the genus Copiopoa, is a lot of these habitat plants are appearing online. And this is what they look like. Bare-rooted. This is what a typical Copiopoa looks like from habitat. Copiopoa columna alba and cinerea are definitely the most sought after ones. So you often see them sold like this, bare-rooted, without roots. Which is highly unusual. A cultivated plant always has the roots on it. Another big issue is, of course, climate change, which I mentioned. These are habitat photos from Chile. There's a couple of areas which I'm keeping really close eye on and taking photographic evidence every few years. But as you can see here, everything in the habitat's dead. And these are plants that are adapted for xeric conditions. And I mean, we've got multiple different plant families here. We've got cacti, we've got bromeliads, we've got plants from the Solanaceae, and they're all, succumbing to climate change. And I mean, we're talking about billions of plants. This is one of the habitats of Copiopoa solaris. Every single plant's dead. And we're literally talking, hundreds and thousands of plants that have died within the last, this habitat, I've got photographs of it from the late 60s, from a friend from Chile, and also in Frederick Ritter's Cacti of South America. He's got photos from this habitat in the 80s, and they were still mostly alive. About 80% of the habitat was still alive, but you go there now and it's completely the opposite. So yeah, climate change is definitely having a big impact in certain areas. I'll just briefly go through this, but South Africa's really, really copping it, or Southern Africa in general. Plants from Namibia, Tanzania, etc., are being poached by the millions. Pachyform plants from Africa. And social media has really kind of accelerated this whole process. I mean, now with the internet, it's so easy for people to be connected internationally, and locals get in on it, and whatever plant's kind of trending at the time just tends to get dug up. The Pachypodium species are really targeted. And then they end up in little kind of niche pop-up stores like this, quite often in it's not just the Asians who are doing it. They usually cop a lot of the blame, but the Europeans are in on it. I'm sure they get up here as well. So, there's a lot of things that we can do. Seed banking is a really important one. They're doing this internationally, and they're really, really focusing on it now in South Africa to preserve some of that genetics there. We can increase the size of national parks. We can even create private reserves for narrow point endemics that are outside of national parks. Patrolling and surveillance is kind of difficult, but cameras can sometimes deter people from taking plants. But I think the biggest thing we can do is harsher penalties, I mean, it's happening in South Africa. People are going to jail for taking plants. It's illegal, and the fines are pretty big. So, that's one way to deter people from poaching. And just education, general education about the topic. So the biggest barriers always seem to be funding. You know, it always seems to be about money, unfortunately, and not a lot of funding goes towards conservation. And we also need knowledgeable people to volunteer their time to help with all of these kinds of projects. Another big difference is cultural differences and language barriers, of course. We're talking about international issues and also corruption. I know in Chile, even with this problem, I mean, the agricultural department, police officials, people working on ports, I mean, you know, you can't hide from or try and pretend that corruption's not involved. These plants are still getting out of these countries somehow. Oh, that's just some of the most one thing that we've been working on, something that we feel like we can do, is create educational material. So we've been publishing these infographics online, helping to explain to people, you know, just generally about the problem of plant poaching, because people usually associate it with animals. They've all heard about animal poaching, but they kind of don't understand what plant poaching is. So the main thing is just to educate people about it, tell them how to make more ethical decisions when it comes to purchasing plants. And we've gone ahead and translated these infographics into multiple different languages. I'll just leave you with this example of Copiopoa alba. Is just, you can apply a lot of these same principles to different habitat plants, but the main thing to look for is damaged roots or no roots at all. It's highly unusual to be sold a succulent plant that doesn't have a root system. But this is a seed-grown Copiopoa alba from this exact same habitat that I'm showing you, so there's a lot of differences. Cacti and succulents are usually pretty beaten up in habitat, pretty weathered. They've got corking, and usually what happens when they form cork tissue is that bacteria and algae colonize it and turn it black. That doesn't happen in cultivation. The spines, the same thing happens. They usually turn black from the alga and bacteria. And damaged spines too. They're worn away in habitat, and usually with transportation, the spines get damaged. So they're all things to look for. Oh, this is what the seed bank looks like in Chile. I've been working with them a little bit on this, helping them to collect some of the most endangered cactus species in Chile. And this project's been funded by the Kew Botanical Gardens. And so, yeah, we go and collect the seeds, or they go and collect the seeds and they dry them out in silica gel. And then they put them in the freezer. They keep them down to, I think it's about -4 Fahrenheit. And so when the seeds are dry and cool, they tend to last a lot longer, sometimes even up to 50 years.